Please pray with me. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you've given us this day, that you've given us the bright sun that will warm us and remind us that you are in control of all that happens in the world. We pray that you will help us to serve you and know your will. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Okay, so we're going to do week 2 here of how not to read the Bible. Then the next week we'll start back to how to read the Bible, and we'll look at themes from Lent. So today's topic is these passages, in particularly the Apostle Paul, where he tells women to be quiet. Right? He says women shouldn't talk, because that's how we usually have encountered it. My hunch is several of you grew up in traditions in which women did not speak up front. Right? They didn't really have a leadership role. There are still plenty of churches that do this, though the arguments are pretty different. So we're going to focus mainly on why Protestant churches might hold this. Catholics, their argument for it is completely different. You can actually have a woman preach in a Catholic church. They just can't do the sacraments, right? And the idea there is the priest who's doing the sacraments is actually standing in for Jesus. So it needs to be a male. Why it doesn't have to be a Jewish male, I don't know, right? It's just Sorry. I have lots of good friends. I have several very close friends who are Catholic priests, and I tell them that. But anyway. So I will also say we're going to talk about, right, men and women, and these words that mean men and women also mean husbands and wives. There's some sort of cultural background here. At one point or two, this is going to be rated PG-13, so just be aware of that. A warning, right? And we're going to focus on the big issues. There's all kinds of things happening in these passages I've put in the handout for you, right? We could talk about all of them all day, right? We're going to highlight one. What does the quiet part mean? First, we'll have to pick up a couple other things like headship, right? But there's also this whole thing about head coverings. At one point we're told women are supposed to keep their head covered because of the angels. Whatever that means, right? So we're not going to focus on that part. We're going to focus on the quiet part, right? But we'll come around to a few other things, right? The text you have before you, I've kind of cleaned up, or actually, to put it better, I've made the translations a little more colloquial. So here's something you should all know. The Bible is actually written, especially the New Testament, is written in a pretty everyday language. It's not written in sort of this high, lofty language. When we translate it in English, it gets better. It actually goes from being pretty everyday talk to literature, because we hold it in such high regard. So there's some times when actually we need it to be more everyday to have it make sense. So I'm going to highlight a few of those things. One way to sort of get into some of these problematic texts is to recognize that a lot has changed in 2,000 years, even with how we write, right? So if I put quotation marks around a word, what does it mean?
Someone said it.
Oftentimes someone has said it, right? We can cite sources. They didn't cite their sources. I tell my students all the time, like, see this right here? This is plagiarism. It's okay if an ancient person does it. It's not okay if you do it. They didn't have ways of doing this. They didn't cite their sources. They didn't even have punctuation. Right? So even we heard this in the sermon today. The very last sentence in Jonah can be translated as a question or a statement. That's because you can actually do it that way, and there's no mark in the sentence to tell us. So we, as people who are studying it, translating it, right, we have to sort of make a decision, right? There's even the fact, this is on your handout on the very top, and I read it on the board too, but they didn't have spaces. Someone about the 9th century AD came up with spaces. Bob is telling me to move, and I'm going to ask exactly what it wants me to do. Okay. So it's on the top, but this is my favorite little example. By the way, they used the New Testament was written in all capitals. They also didn't have lowercase letters yet. What does that say? God is now here, or God is nowhere? It could be both. Right? So this is just my little example of the original forms. There's no spaces between words. There's no sentence breaks. There's no punctuation marks. That's stuff that we came up with way afterwards. Right. It's also the case, like, it isn't where, like, Mark is writing his gospel and he writes chapter 1, verse 1. We added that stuff in to help us be able to refer to it, right? So just the point is, all of this, the Bible you have before you, one, it's translated. It's also been edited. And that's a good thing. We need that to happen. But all of that stuff, right, is stuff that we can argue about. We can argue, where does a sentence end? Because it's not in the original manuscript. So we're going to see a couple examples of that, right? By the way, even on this stuff with spaces, that's still the case. If you were to read a newspaper in Chinese, for example, they don't have spaces between their words, and they don't really have punctuation either, right? People who read this way. I don't read Chinese. I read Hebrew rather poorly, but I can read it. And a modern Israeli newspaper usually doesn't print its papers with vowels in it. It's just the consonants, right? I mean, it's a whole different script, but that's how the people can read, right? So we actually make it easy for ourselves. We have punctuation and quotation marks and spaces and vowels and all these kinds of things, right? The history of reading doesn't work this way, right? Which means that when we're reading the Bible in a contemporary version of the original language, it's been highly edited. Scholars want to go back to their old manuscripts and look at things, right? So this is just to realize the text that we have before us is edited 99.999% of the time. There are no problems. Occasionally there are, right? And there's also problems with things like words. So here's a little interesting fact. Ancient Greek has no word for husband or wife. You simply refer to your spouse as my man or my woman. When it wants to talk about men and women or husbands and wives, it uses the same word. So when we're reading it and putting it in English, we have to figure out, we have to make a decision. Are they talking about men here? Or are they talking about husbands? So when it says things like women should be quiet, they should go home and learn, is it talking about all women everywhere, all times? Or it's talking about the wives here in this congregation? Right, we have to make those sorts of decisions. Right, so if you look at the handout I gave to you, I've got some things on there. I also put some other things on there just for us to think about the importance of what all this would do. So I put the sentence on there, let's eat grandma. Do you see why commas are important? Or how about this one? But even the meaning of a word, right? This would be what we mean husband or wife, right? So I write two sentences that are the same. Your argument is sound. What does that mean? It means it's a good argument. How about if I say your argument is sound, and I say under my breath, only a sound. It's the same sentence, but it has a very different meaning, right? We need to just recognize that words are used in different ways. Things like, I experience this all the time with email and texting of, is someone using a satire? Or are they serious? Those things are hard to pick up in the written word, right? So think of even, we've just heard 4 weeks of sermons on Jonah. Jonah is a parody. It is a satire. Troy and Christina brought this out, right? But thousands of years of Christians have read it as a straightforward story about a guy who got swallowed by fish. But it's not. It's actually a parable that's supposed to make you laugh. Jonah does all kinds of weird things.
So they didn't have emoticons either?
Well, I didn't have emoticons either. No. Which again, I don't like. I get texts from like younger people. I'm not old enough that I get texts from young people with an emoticon. I'm like, I don't know what this means. Like, I have no idea what this is supposed to be doing. Or I use them wrong. Right? Okay, quickly, I want to look, before we get to Paul's passages, 2 passages from Genesis. Only one of them's on the handout. The first thing we should point out is, in Genesis 3, this is not on the handout, the fall happens. Adam and Eve eat from the tree they fall into a sin. God comes and says, well, where are you? And then gives them consequences, right? The snake has to crawl on its belly. Eve has pain in childbirth, and Adam is told he has to work hard. Right? Notice that those things are consequences of sin. So this is what it actually says, Genesis 3. To the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth your children. Yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. So the men ruling over women is a consequence of sin. It is not the order that God established. So Christians who are trying to live into a redeemed world should say, hey, this isn't the way the world ought to be. The men rule over women, right? This becomes clear in Genesis 2. We go back a chapter. This is on your handout. The first thing I want to highlight here is there's a bunch of things happening in this passage, right? We're going to focus on one thing at the beginning, one thing at the end, and then I'm going to point out to you there's a really funny and kind of naughty joke in the middle. It really is a joke here. The first thing is that God says to Adam, it's not good that the man should be alone. By the way, Adam's name just means a man, and it means from the earth, right? I will make him a helper as his partner. This word helper has a long history of us being told that women are helpers to men. They're assistants. They don't really get to do the main thing. First problem with this is at least 14 times in the Old Testament, the same word is used to talk about God. So it can't be that the helper is a subordinate. God is described as the helper of humans. So it can't mean that. It's actually a military term. It means ally. Actually, the best way to think of this is the person who stands next to you, and you've got a sword and they've got a spear. Right? It's partner, ally, or that's actually what it means. It isn't like Adam needs someone to like clean his clothes. It's no, he needs someone to go to war with. That's what this term is saying, right? So it isn't inferior at all, right? Then we get a joke. So I want to point this out to you. We get this very serious creation story of God creates human beings, he creates Adam, Adam needs a helper, right? And so what does God do? What's the response? Most people seem to think, well, it's this weird thing that happens in the middle. God said Adam needs a helper, then he creates all the other animals, and then he gets back to Adam. No, that's not what's happening. What happens? Verse 18, God says, it's not good that the man should be alone, I'll make him a helper. So, that's a logical connecting word. God says Adam needs a helper. So what's God do? He makes all the animals. All the birds. This is what's happening here. God starts creating animals. So Adam's standing over here and God says, Adam, here is a elephant. Will this be your partner? Nope. This is literally what the text means. God parades all of the animals, all of the created animals before him. It's kind of a little bit of a naughty joke. And every time Adam's like, uh-oh. Right? And so the whole point is Adam has to learn that. What does he need? To go back to Genesis 1, God makes animals each of their own kind. Adam also needs someone of his own kind. He needs someone equal to him to be his partner. Someone who's just like him. And it's reinforced with humor. It's actually, I mean, if you read, there's a lot of a Jewish commentary that they get that this is a joke. They highlight it. The Christians are the ones who are like, don't let's, the Bible can't possibly tell a joke like that. It does. It's a serious point being reinforced with sort of a humorous story. Right? At the end of this, right, we get the story of, right, God makes Adam fall asleep, takes out one of his ribs, right, and makes Eve out of him, right. This whole idea that a woman, which literally means in Hebrew, the word is out of a man, right, was taken out of a man, right. This will become a big deal for Paul. Paul's going to talk about this a lot. He refers to this. Okay, that's sort of this Old Testament background, right. So let's look at two passages. We have time, we can look at more, but this is what I have in the handout. The first one you'll see there is 1 Timothy 2. Right? This is the one where, I mean, if you read sort of a standard English translation, it says something like women should be quiet in the church. Right? And I'm going to show you that this isn't what it means at all. So I'm going to read it. I'll skip some parts here or there, but I'm going to read over it. So the context of this is Paul is writing a letter to Timothy, who's sort of one of his assistants, who he's put in charge of this church, probably in Ephesus. And he's giving him some advice. There's some conflict here. And this is what Paul tells him. He says, this is what I want. I want a man should pray in every place, lifting up pious hands without anger or quarreling. So the men have been causing trouble. They've been arguing. They've been angry with each other and with other people, right? Paul says, I want them to stop doing this. I want them to go to church and pray. But this doesn't mean just fold your hands and pray. It means worship and participate, right? And to stop being angry. So there's conflict happening in the conflict of the worship service, what they're doing, right? He wants this to stop, right? In the same way, too, so for the same reason, he says, I want women to dress appropriately with modesty and good sense, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes. Literally, it says braided hair, right? So I think the idea is they're braiding things into their hair, right? And they're showing off. And he's saying, no, we don't need this. Like, just look normal, right? That's kind of what he's trying to say. He's like, don't show off. Or, right? There's going to be more to this coming, right? But instead, he says, as is appropriate for women who profess to be godly with good deeds. So he says, dress yourself with good deeds, not with fancy clothes and hairstyles, right? And then this is the verse where it usually gets translated, women should be quiet. Right? And it's almost like a command. Let the women be quiet. Like it looks like he's wagging his finger at them. It's a really weird word for quiet. In Corinthians, we'll see the normal word for quiet, which is actually is telling them, shut up. Here he's telling them not to be quiet. He says, let the women learn in quietness, would be the sort of direct translation. Give them the space and the time to go learn. They need to have quiet to do this, right? This is, and then he goes on to say, that is not to say that I am now commanding that the women should teach or dominate a man, but rather that she should be left to learn in quietness, right? There's a conflict here in this church. This is in Ephesus. There's a big cult there, to Aphrodite, which is an all-women-led cult. And part of what Paul is saying is we need to distinguish ourselves from that group. So here we'll have men and women in leadership, and the women are not going to dominate the men. The actual context here is the history of this is women should be quiet and men are in charge. The context here is in this church, the women have taken over. And Paul is coming in and saying, hey, you need to let the men speak too. And he says, by the way, this is where he is kind of wagging his finger at these women who have taken over. He's saying, remember Adam and Eve? He says, Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived, but the woman was, right? Right. So his point is, why was this the case? Well, if you read that Genesis story carefully, who does God tell you can't eat from the tree? We didn't read it. I'm making you test your Bible knowledge. He tells Adam before Eve is created. So Adam was supposed to tell her, and I think he forgot. Right? But that's actually what Paul's using this for. He thinks his audience understands this well enough. Right? That the reason why the women need to be given time to learn in quietness or tranquility is, when that doesn't happen, look what happens. Well, this is actually him advocating for women to be given the time to study, and so that they can participate. It isn't telling them to not ever talk. It's actually advocating for them. Right? So a passage that we have taken to mean one thing pretty much means the opposite. Right? And then we get this is the one that always bothers everybody, but she will be saved through a childbearing if she continues in faith, love, and holiness with modesty. This seems to say women are saved by having children, they don't do anything else. Right? But again, what is the consequence of the fall back in the Genesis story? Pain and suffering through childbirth. Right? So this is actually a statement of undoing the effects of the fall. Right?
What about all the children's noise that they'll make later?
This is actually part of what's being advocated here. They need to have time. Right? It's everybody's supposed to get time to do what they need to do, to study, to read the Bible, to these sorts of things, right? But this isn't actually saying anything about women being quiet. It's actually saying that they should be able to learn in quietness. Right? Okay, so that one, this is the one everybody always points to for women shouldn't talk, and I just said, no, this is not what it means at all. 1 Corinthians, however, is different. Right? So I put two big passages from 1 Corinthians on here. We don't have time to read them all. 1 Corinthians 14, and you can see I've highlighted it with a box. I've actually translated it twice. I'll explain that why in a minute. But verse 34, it's in that box. It says, women should keep silent in the churches. Right? That's just this pretty much means what it says. It means women should be quiet. Right? But this is the issue. If we go up 3 chapters earlier, in chapter 11, this is where we get all these weird things about women having their head covered. Right? Look at what he says. So this is first paragraph on the page. Right? He says, I commend you because you remember me in everything, and just as I handed them on to you, you keep the traditions. But I want you to know this, that Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of his wife, and God is the head of Christ. Any man who prays or prophesies with something on his head brings a shame on his head, and any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled brings shame on her head. Right? So let's put all the headship stuff and head covering stuff aside. What is happening? He's giving us rules for what people ought to do when they pray or prophesy. This does not mean when you go home and do it by yourself. This is technical language here. It's public. So these are the rules for what men and women should do when they stand up front of the church and talk. So chapter 11, he gives us rules for, this is how men ought to do it. This is how women ought to do it. And then chapter 14, he tells us women should be quiet. So did he forget what he wrote 2 chapters earlier? Did he change his mind? He didn't go back and change it? There's on a surface level of contradiction contradiction, right? But it's just worth pointing out, this is actually what he's doing for us here, is he's telling us when men and women get up and speak, how ought they present themselves. So let's actually talk about the context of that, right? We're in Corinth now. Corinth also has a bunch of sort of Roman and Greek cults. This is the PG-13 part. One of the ways you worship at some of these cults is to spend time with a temple prostitute. It's actually what you would do, right? Christians are not into this. Not the way that they do things, right? So they want to distinguish themselves first. So this is one of the things we're trying to say. This is not what we're up to here. We do things differently here, right? Two, it was the case that at least among the Jews, women kept their head covered. Hair was something only your husband or your kids would see. It was just the culture, right? They were actually a whole lot like rather contemporary conservative Islam. Women, they didn't wear something over their face, but their hair would have been completely covered, right? And actually, I mean, if you've ever spent much time in a museum with ancient Greek statues, start paying attention to how many of the women have their head veiled. Not all of them, but often they do, right? So this was definitely the case among the Jews. Lots of the Greeks did this too. Women had their head covered. It was just the sort of cultural thing to do, right? Let me give you a quick example, right? I have memories when I was fairly young of women wearing hats to church. Right? We don't really do this anymore. We don't enforce these rules, but there used to be an expectation of women should wear a hat when they go to church. Well, this is where that comes from. It was this passage taken in a literal way, right? We don't really enforce it anymore, right? But what would you do if Troy got up and preached a sermon wearing his New York Yankees baseball hat? I mean, the Yankees problem is the first problem. But I mean, we would actually be pretty upset if a male came into church wearing a hat, I think. Right? It's okay to do it in the mire, but you don't do it here. Right? So we still actually do have some sort of cultural rules of there are places you don't do certain things, right? There are expectations. Well, think of this as a really strict one. It's a religious one. It's fulfilling the sexual mores, basically, of women shouldn't have their hair exposed, right? If you're a woman in Corinth at this time, and you're walking out on the street and you have your hair down, it's not even up in a bun, and it's long and it's down and it's not covered, you're advertising. Right? You're basically saying, I'm a prostitute. Right? That's what many people would think. Right? What's happened here is we've got now this new Christian community, and part of its message is, you are free from the law. So you have people saying, I don't have to do this. I can let my hair down. I'm free from these things. Maybe some of them thought it was oppressive, but they're going into a church with their hair uncovered, right? It's causing a stir, right? I mean, the equivalent would be a female pastor who's very scantily clad, right? We wouldn't be thinking about what she's telling us. So this is kind of what's going. So Paul is saying, hey guys, come on. Yes, you're free, but we need to be reasonable. This is a frequent thing Paul has to tell people. If you read through his letters, it comes up over and over again. He's telling them, yes, you're free. Your salvation doesn't depend on these things. We don't have to keep all these cultural rules. We can push on them, but you don't use your freedom to harm others, to scandalize others. It's actually his constant rule is take other people into account. So freedom is never freedom to say, I get to do what I want. It's, I use my freedom for the sake of others. That's what he's telling us here, right? Put your hair up, right? We don't do this now because this isn't an issue for us, right? He's going to get in here. I mean, this is the thing I always point out to people. People are like, no, this is the Bible, this is what it says, right? He tells us, verse 13, I put it in italics, judge for yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray with her head unveiled? Doesn't nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is shameful to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is to her glory. Okay, women should have long hair, men should have short hair. I've seen a lot of pictures of Jesus all over the church. Did he ever have short hair? It's long hair. Why? He wouldn't have worn long hair, by the way. Jesus definitely had short hair. Why does all of our art have him wearing long hair? Because all that art comes from at least the 4th century, about 400 years afterwards. By the time all these social mores have been changed, and Jesus is actually being depicted as a Greek god. He's in the style of a Greek god, sort of, so that we can identify him in that culture of. That's why he has long hair. Right? He had a short hair. No, sort of good Jewish boy in the 1st century AD is going to wear long hair because people had ideas like this. Right? But our art depicts him differently because it comes from a way later date, and it's clear that. By that time, they're not really reading these verses and saying, "Oh, we shouldn't wear long hair," right? Because it's a cultural thing, right? So this isn't giving us the directions to say this is what we ought to do for all time. It's culturally specific advice. We need to figure out what's going on in our culture, right? Because there are still things that are appropriate and inappropriate to do. This is what 1 Corinthians is all about, by the way. Almost the whole book is Paul having to deal with conflict. Right? He planted a church, now he's gone to plant a church elsewhere. And there's all this conflict happening here, and they've written him a letter. He's writing a letter back. Right? So we're actually told that. He says, I'm responding to you. So he's taking care of these things. He's being told there's this conflict here. Women have their hair down. What are we supposed to do about this? Someone's saying. It bothers me. And Paul's saying, well, come on. This isn't that big of a deal. Right? But, there was actually a conversation happening. Right? And there needs to be some pushback. There needs to be some argument. I mean, is this a reasonable request or not? Right? Come up with something contemporary, right? I would be a little embarrassed if my wife got up and preached with jeans with holes in them. Like, come on.
They're expensive.
But if the youth want to get up and wear those sorts of things, I'm a little more relaxed, right? This is a style. It isn't that big of a deal, right? There's wiggle room, right? And this is a conversation that's ongoing. At this time, Paul's having to say, hey, here's how we're going to handle this at this point. Right? So this is what's happening here, right? But he's actually saying, hey, women, when you get up front and speak, don't address in a way that's going to scandalize anyone. Pretty basic rule, right? And he's got this whole thing about, by the way, the verse 3 of people take this as somehow what? Christ is the head of every man. The word here is male. It's not just mankind, it's male. The husband is the head of his wife, but again, this is man and woman. And then God is the head of Christ. This is where the headship stuff comes from. Right, of man is above woman. Right? Well, it doesn't come in order, first thing. It says Christ man, man, woman, and then God in Christ. So that means somehow Christ is afterwards? This is actually the order of creation. It goes back to the creation story. God creates Adam, and then takes Eve out of Adam. And then if we read the Bible as a story, Jesus doesn't come till way afterwards. Right? He's there eternal. He's God, the eternal Son, but he doesn't come on the earth till afterwards. This is him telling this story. This actually points to us what this headship thing means. It doesn't mean authority. How else do we use the word head? Where's the head of the Grand River? The source. Because that's what this language does, right? God is the source of man. Man, in a sense, is the source of woman in the creation story. Right? We're told in our theology that Christ proceeds eternally from God the Father, comes out from him, right? This is what this is doing. It's not authority talk, it's a source talk, talking about the creation story, right? He's going to go on to tell us men aren't independent from women, women are independent from men, right? Because he says, for just as a woman came from a man, so a man comes through women. All of us have moms. It's basically what he's telling us, right? Okay, so let's go to 1 Corinthians 14. Okay, so this is a couple of chapters. Afterwards, we've got all these rules in chapter 11 and 12 for basically how we should conduct a worship service that's decently and in order. Chapter 13 is the famous chapter on love. Love is patient, love is kind, right? Then we get chapter 14, which is more now the rules for how things should happen, right? So this is what's happening. What has been happening in Corinth is utter chaos. Because he says, when you come together, each one of you has a hymn, a teaching, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let everything be done for the building up of the church. If anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be only 2 or at most 3 at each in turn. This should tell us what has been happening is everybody's coming to the church service. They all got something to say and they're talking over each other. It's chaos, right? It isn't a pastor up front speaking. It's people in the pews getting up to speak and they're like, I'm speaking now. Or no, I'm speaking. And they're talking over each other. It's multiple people speaking at once. It's chaos. And what we should really realize is it's a fight for who's got the power. And Paul's saying, do everything for building up. This isn't about building up. You're tearing down others because you want to be in the church. Right? So he's giving us rules. He's saying, no, someone's got to sort of direct traffic. Right? If someone's got things to say, well, you go now and then you go. Right? I mean, it's a very different kind of a church service. We should maybe talk about that. As Presbyterians, we'd be very uncomfortable if someone got up and started speaking in tongues. That's a topic for another kind of time. Right? But this is what he's telling us, right? This is how this ought to be. If someone does speak in tongues but no one's there to interpret, they shouldn't say anything at all. Right? It's for everybody. Right? When we get this language of prophets, it's where we need some little education. This language doesn't mean people who tell the future. It means people who have a word to say. It's basically what a sermon is. A sermon is a prophecy. It is an explanation and application of a biblical passage. Right? This is very early. So it would have all been from the Old Testament. Or, and they did have this idea of God is speaking to me. I'm going to tell you what God is saying. Right? Right. So they've got rules. Right? And then he says, and the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. And then we get this problem of where does the comma sentence come from? Is there a new sentence here? Right. So is it, in column 1, for God is not a disorder, God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, period. And then as in all the churches of the saints, women should be quiet. Or is it, for God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints, period. Kind of makes a difference in what you're going to do with it. So here's a couple of things we need to know. Verses 34 and 35 are a huge problem, not just in terms of what they say, but simply in terms of the text. So in almost half of the ancient manuscripts that we have, they move. They show up after verse 40. So whenever someone was copying them, they didn't know where to put them. And there was disagreement. So one of them, there's a biblical scholar named Gordon Fee. He's very conservative. He's a Pentecostal, teaches at a pretty conservative school, the Regent, which is in Vancouver, Canada. So this is not like a liberal person who wants to tell stuff. His argument is these are not original at all. Someone added them in afterwards to make a point about women, toss them. He just says they're not part of what Paul said at all. I'm not quite prepared to do that. But I want to point out to you that this is actually an argument being made by actually a fairly conservative biblical scholar, right? He says they're not original, we don't need them, right? It went from verse 33 to verse 36. Problem solved, right? But there is something strange happening, right? Because they move, right? These verses move as a unit. So verse 33 has to be the way that I put it in the box. Other people do, like a lot of our contemporary translations want to read it like the other column. I think they have to be like this. So what do they mean? Right? Because here he is saying women should be quiet. Right? I think it should be translated wives should be quiet, which is the way I've done it. And I actually think it's technical enough to say they're not permitted to not talk, but to chat. So here's what I think is happening. Corinth is a newish town. The Romans built it about the first century BC, intentionally as a colony in Greece. And it's become a huge trade center, right? So it's a big business town. All kinds of businesses come in and out. So people from all over the empire are coming here, right? It's in the east, and people speak Greek. Greek is like English is today at this time. It's the language of trade. If you want to do business, whether you're in Argentina or China, you got to speak English. There's actually business English, where you can't talk about sort of basic things like going to the bathroom, but you can talk about trading stocks, right? So people would speak Greek, even if it wasn't their native tongue. So you've got people in Corinth that are probably from like way up north, they're from the west where they speak Latin, they're from way over in the Middle East where they speak Hebrew or Aramaic or Syriac, all these things, right? Down from Egypt. What are you going to do when you have a church service? What language are you going to use if all these new people are coming in? You're going to use Greek because it's the one language everybody can speak. That's why our New Testament is written in Greek by a bunch of people who it's not their first language. Only book written in the Bible in Greek where the person's a native speaker is Luke-Acts. Everything else you could read it and you go, that's not the way you say that because you're not a native speaker. They actually make errors in grammar. Right? So what's happening? Well, who's probably doing the business in the married couple? The man probably is. This is still a pretty patriarchal culture, right? So you go to a church service. Let's say you move to, I don't know, Thailand to start a business. And your husband learns enough English to be able to conduct his business. But what language are you speaking at home? Thai, or whatever your native tongue is, right? When you go to a church, and all of a sudden you guys decided to go to church, right? You probably can't understand the person speaking very well, whether it's a man or a woman up front, right? If you're the wife of this couple that's moved here. By the way, this is still the case in the Middle East. You go to a church service, women sit on one side, men sit on the other. So all the women are sitting over here. And there's a group of them who all speak whatever, and they're bored because they can't understand what's happening. And they start to talk. They start to chat during the middle of the church service. They're like kids. Right? And the pastor up front's going to say, hey, be quiet. Right? And it also seems to be they're asking questions. When I look at that, it says, like, if they've got a question, let them ask their husband at home. He could hear it and understand it. He can explain it to you at home. That's actually the context here. Right? It's not women don't ever speak forever, because he just told us earlier that women are actually up front speaking. So we have to do the hard work to figure out what's happening here. It can't be don't ever talk, because he just told us women are talking. 3 chapters earlier. It's like just a couple hundred words earlier. He's actually giving us instructions for women speaking. So it can't mean that. What does it mean? Well, this is one plausible way to sort of explain it, right? If you've got a question to ask your husband at home, what does this tell us? People are talking during the church service because he's just giving us all these rules. Hey, if you speak in tongues, only have a couple people do it. It's going down the list. These are all the problems you guys told me about. Oh, the wives are talking. Well, stop talking. Right? That's his answer to it. Okay, we're up for time. I guess I could take a question or two, but other than if you need to get to the service, which I need to do too, so yeah.
Isn't all that kind of compounded by the fact that 2 emperors concatenated the whole Bible, and therefore 2 males, and therefore women dial out of it?
That process is a lot more complicated. The Bible coming together. I mean, here's sort of a fascinating fact. The first time we get someone making a list of the books of the Bible that has authority, like this is the list, is the 16th century. Because the Reformation happened and they're arguing over it. Up until that point, there was not a need for a list. Practice dictated for the list. These are the books that we use. They came into being. They started ruling books out pretty early. Toss this one, toss this one, toss this one. But the canon, so we call the books under the authority, it was just kind of agreed upon until the Reformation. Right? The real issue with all this stuff about women is, it does have to do with the emperors, which is, so Constantine becomes emperor in 324 of the whole empire, right? By the end of that century, so the 300s, the 4th century, Christianity has gone from being illegal and at times persecuted to being illegal, to being privileged, to being the only legal religion in about 100 years. That's a big set of changes, right? So what happens then? All of a sudden, I mean, it's not only that Christianity is allowed, it's actually, you're going to get ahead in the world if you're a Christian. The conversions were just mass. Everybody's becoming a Christian, right? There's a whole part of problems with that. A lot of it's pretty much just, I'm going to convert because that's what I need to do, but I don't really believe any of this. But it also means you have to create structures. So early on, before the 300s, Christians would hide out because it's illegal.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily know the people in the other town that are a few miles away that are Christian. Right now, you know where everything is. People are building huge churches. The government's dumping money into it, right? You need rules for the institution, so they began to sort of come up with pretty strict ways of doing things. Order. And one of the things that they did fairly early on was they slowly began to sort of push women out of leadership. So we actually have all kinds of evidence up until sort of the empire becomes Christian, that women are leading. Right? And then when this happens, the church begins to take on the sort of features of the culture and pushes women out. And then you can take a different way of reading these passages. You can point to passages where you say, oh, it says women shouldn't talk, so they're not going to talk. And you can spin it in a different way. Right? But I mean, that's part of the thing. It's Christianity is isolated. There's little pockets of it, and they don't always get along. It's actually why they have to have all these big councils afterwards. So like, oh, we've been apart for 100 years or more. We've found out we're doing things a little differently. We don't always agree. Let's get on the same page. Right? But one of the consequences of that was actually women got pushed out of leadership when early on they were in. I mean, Paul is actually, he's portrayed as being kind of anti-woman, is actually radically inclusive of them for his time. we need to recover that, right? But he's also not a modern person. He's got his sensibilities of his time. Anyone else? Okay. Now next week will be Lent.
Going.